This is going to be a really interesting discussion, the title of which is Land Vanishing. So we are joined by Amy Cotter, who is the Director of Climate Strategies here at the Lincoln Institute, Rachel Cleetus from the Union of Concerned Scientists, Daryl Fairweather, who is Chief Economist at Redfin, and Lanor Curole, you're joining us remotely from United Houma Nation. And our journalist moderator is Alexandra Tempus, freelancer and author who is also working on a book on this very subject. So Alexandra, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and thank all of you. It's been an honor to learn so much from everyone over the last couple of days and to share this space with these distinguished panelists. So yesterday, we talked about how we as journalists get people to care, and even sometimes people within our own organizations. And last night, Ron Susskind talked about the power of stories that get us to gather around the campfire. Stories that bring us together have the potency to catalyze change. And so a lot of climate coverage has justifiably, engaged with the issue as a, paradigm-shifting political story, economic story, a science story. And a lot of times the human story is lost amid all of that. And particularly when it comes to the stories of people on the ground right now dealing with the reality of land disappearing beneath their feet. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Lanor. Lanor, you're there in Louisiana. You're in a community that is dealing with, land actually disappearing in front of you. And can you just start, set the stage a little bit for us about what it's like there on the ground?
Sure, and thank you guys for having me. I apologize if I sound a little bit like a young man going through puberty. My voice is just coming back. I was hoping to be there with you guys and got sick. So I think, for me, the only way to kind of do this is to share my story and kind of tell you who I am and where I've come from, really. I grew up in a small community called Golden Meadow, Louisiana. I lived primarily in the tribal community that I will say is often referred to as below Golden Meadow. We were not within the corporation limits, which is where the tribal community resided. My grandparents lived very traditionally, seasonally. My grandfather was a fisherman, a trapper throughout the years. And so he would go from one season to another. So for us, the seasons typically were not spring, summer, fall, and winter. They were hunting season, they were trapping season, and then his large spring garden and those kinds of things, and how the family would actually move at those different time periods. And so and the family worked hand in hand doing all of that. My mom was the second of their children, and she went to what was an Indian settlement school. And so Louisiana at that point in time, and that community, pre-integration, had a tri-tiered education system. So my mom could only go to the 7th grade. My grandparents actually, there was no school for them. The school wasn't built and moved there until the 1930s. And so my grandparents only spoke what we commonly refer to as Houma French. And so it's a blending of our traditional tribal language with the French language. And my mom, when she went to school, that was the only language she spoke, and she learned English by going to school. One of the things that I always thought was really funny and tongue-in-cheek was she always said she never could learn fractions, because in the trapping season, the family would move to the trapping camp in the wintertime, and they always taught fractions in that time period. So she said she never learned fractions, because she always missed those lessons. But so my mom had a 7th grade education. My dad is non-native. and he actually had members of his family that I think never really had a very strong relationship with him after he married my mom. There were not the greatest relationships there. And for us, one of the things growing up, I saw, what I, never realized was, and what I thought, and what I, still think today is just so very beautiful was what I had always seen for my grandfather is just such a hard work ethic and working sun up to sundown and never really taking a day off and that kind of stuff. And that has always been an inspiration to me because he always provided for the family. And so those were things that were truly, I think, something that within our family is, he was the oldest of 15 children and would take care of helping his brothers and sisters. And so it was a bigger family context. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone in the neighborhood was family. And so cousins and everybody, were tight knit. But education was a huge issue for my mom, and recognizing that. So of her children, it was hugely important that we all graduated. And that we all, that we seriously considered college as an option. So all three of her children are college or high school graduates. Two of her children have a bachelor's degree and I have a master's. And so those were things that were hugely important to her, to be able to do that. And so, for me, the whole thing of, folks often say, why do you stay? And, all of these things are happening, and all of the climate change issues and community is battling, and how many times can you continue to rebuild? It's your home. It's all of those memories that are attached to it. It's like, for me, one of the things that is always so heartbreaking after any hurricane is what happens for us in Southeast Louisiana is when flooding happens, a lot of the way our graves are buried because of the water table is the graves are not dug very deep because it doesn't take long to hit water. And so a lot of the graves pop up, and then they have to go back and find where they belong and move them back. And that's heartbreaking, and so that always, I'll be quite honest, has been one of my biggest fears is after a hurricane or anything is because my mom passed away in 92 is, oh my God, am I ever going to have to be a person to have to go back and rebury my mom, or my grandparents. And, so it's like leaving them behind. And how do you do that? And so there's a huge part of that it's heartbreaking. And how do you make that move?
Thanks so much for sharing that, Lanor. It's really moving. When it comes to this issue of land vanishing, we've had to approach it from sort of glancing angles, over the last decade or so. It's a housing story, or it's about buyout programs after a hurricane, or it's about community resiliency or adaptation. We've kind of reached an inflection point here in the last couple of years where we can actually start to go directly at the thing and say, people are moving. People are having to talk about moving in response to climate change. There is, in fact, a climate migration happening, cross-border and critically also inside borders. Most climate-driven migration happens inside national borders. So this is a phenomenon that will reshape the face of this country, as well as our international dynamics. So with that, I'm going to turn it to our first panelist, Amy. Amy, the term managed retreat has sort of been the default for the last few years as this discussion has developed. Among those in the land policy and climate adaptation spheres. So Lincoln Institute's partner, the Climate Migration Network, has been developing a framework that moves away from the term managed retreat. And I guess, you can talk maybe tell us a little bit about why that is and, why framing this is important.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Lanor, for telling your story. I think it's a real privilege for all of us to hear you tell your story in your words. And I wonder if I could ask Lanor, what does managed retreat mean to you?
I just kind of laugh. I think it's a pretty funny term myself. From a community perspective, I think it's funny that we feel the need to manage a group of adults. And so like, who's managing this and how are we being managed? And I understand we have to have terminology and that's just kind of the way it is. But I think sometimes folks are trying to find a way to make some of this stuff palatable, and some of it is just not. It's just not palatable. And so I don't know, and I don't know that I have the answer of the right terminology, but it just strikes me as funny because I've actually just recently learned of the term, so I just thought it was really funny.
Thank you for. I suspected it might not resonate terribly well. And we heard yesterday from Ona Ferguson of the Consensus Building Institute who mentioned the Climate Migration Network, and we work with them on this because we feel really strongly that as we look to the local level to make decisions that cumulatively have these global trends, we do need to make decisions that community needs to make decisions that work for them, that are supported and informed by those of us who are not members of their community. And the Climate Migration Network strives to help practitioners like myself, policymakers, decision makers, writers, learn not to come into a room and be the expert, but to come into the room and support the people who are experts in their own experience and lives. And part of figuring out how to support communities that are making the incredibly difficult decisions about what to do when they're in harm's way, I think we all need to avoid the term managed retreat. There are two problems with it, managed and retreat. And Lenore has talked about what adult among us, who among us wants to be managed? That's just not that's a non-starter in its own way. And so is the notion of retreat, which has come to be synonymous with backing away from a challenge or walking away. And neither of those are going to leave potential relocation on the table for a community that's considering how to respond to harm's way. Studies last year, for example, found that use of that term can shut down the conversation before it even starts. You might be part of an effort to catalyze conversation or support conversation, but if you go there saying, we have a managed retreat plan, nobody's going to stick around and listen long enough to learn the components of the plan. So what the Climate Migration Network and others are turning to are alternatives like supported relocation, community-led relocation. I wasn't going to mention graceful relocation, but because of the reaction we got, hazard avoidance, or simply climate migration.
It's funny, there's sort of a bunch of different trends all happening at once here. And data from the last census shows us population growth in areas more exposed to climate risk, actually. So there are a lot of people moving into the hurricane-prone coastal South, into the mega drought-ridden West. That's where some of our fastest growing cities are. There's multiple factors. There's also other, trends that indicate that people are starting to take climate into account when they make housing decisions. So I wanted to ask Daryl, how do we reconcile these trends, and what are the ripple effects?
Yeah, so as the chief economist of Redfin, I think about climate change from the perspective of the homeowner and the home buyer. And when thinking of it through that lens, it's easy to see how housing is going to become more unequal with climate change. So with climate change, there are going to be some homes that need to be built to be more resilient, and that's going to cost money. And the people who can afford that are the people who already have money. Some people are going to move away from areas where they don't like the climate anymore to some place that has a better climate. And the people who are able to move are going to be the people who have the money to do that. And what I worry about is that over time, housing has become even more unequal than it is right now. We're short 4 million housing units according to Freddie Mac, and if you talk to the National Low-Income Housing Commission, it's more like 7 million. So we are already in this really bad place with housing where some people are doing fine and their home values go up and they're able to put more money into their homes and keep getting that wealth. And some people are just stuck not being able to reap any of those benefits. And with climate change, I think it's going to be really unfortunate when one community is told they have to relocate and another community is able to get the resources to make that resilient, whether it's their own personal resources or they're able to lobby their government to invest in it. So it's just really fascinating to think about climate change and the intersection of housing, because I think that's where it's going to hit people home the hardest, when they're the ones who are having to put a metal tin roof on their house to make it more resilient to fire, or lift their home up on stilts to make it more resilient to flood. I think that's when people are really going to start to see that there are big economic impacts, and some people can be resilient to that and other people can't.
Rachel, we know that climate-driven relocation can be an effective measure when it comes to reducing harm, in purely those terms, reducing harm from flooding or wildfire. But we also know, and Lanor, I'm sure, can attest to this, the idea of it can also just divide communities and have a net negative effect when we're talking about something as foundational as shifting where you live. So I guess how do we, how much of a role should relocation play in the context of making communities more resilient?
Yeah, so maybe my starting point here is perhaps to inject a little bit of the science, what we're seeing with climate change. And one aspect in this vanishing land story is, of course, sea level rise, accelerating sea level rise around the world. And NOAA just released a report in February that many of you saw that said within the lifetime of a mortgage issued today, by 2050, we're going to see as much sea level rise as we've seen in the last 100 years. And that's about 10 to 12 inches on average in the US, but at the eastern Gulf Coast are sea level rise hotspots because of the coincidence with land subsidence, so even higher levels there. And then when you look out to the end of the century, we're talking about at least 2 feet up to 7 feet, depending on what happens with our emissions and what happens with ice sheets and ice sheet stability, which, as we're all seeing in the news these days, things are a lot more worrisome than scientists had even thought 10 years ago. So we are starting to reach some of those tipping points that are truly momentous and scary and profound. So what's happening is communities who've contributed the least to this problem, communities like Lenor's, are on the front lines of risks that are being created primarily from emissions, not only from rich countries, but from rich households in rich countries. And that's the fundamental inequity of climate change. It's not just about emissions in the atmosphere, it's about how it's refracted through our systems. And when it comes to land and housing and everything else, infrastructure, all of those things, what it's getting refracted through is our history of structural racism and colonialism. So what that means is, who has the right to own land? What kind of ownership rights do they have? Where were they allowed to live? Where are they allowed safely to go? All of these things are mediated through these legacies. So humans have always been on the move all around the world. The difference is the sense of agency. If you are in a nomadic community and that is part of a lifestyle that you have embraced and have agency around, that's one thing. But when you are pushed to the limits of adaptation and you are forced into situations that you had no choice in creating and no choice out of, you don't have options, That's the problem. And right now, all around the world, including here in the US, we've got millions of people, billions of dollars of real estate, and trillions of dollars of real estate, infrastructure, et cetera, in places that are low-lying. And sea level rise is just one of those existential threats. Extreme heat, drought. The US is in the midst of a mega drought right now, and we're running up against the limits of water. Wildfire situations out west are getting truly catastrophic and year-round. So many, many more people are going to be on the move, and that's what the latest IPCC report, the Working Group 2 report, pointed out. And they're pointing out the risks of compounding, cascading risks. So climate risks colliding with each other, and also with things like pandemics, wars, food shortages, poverty. So in this moment, it's not enough to be reactive. We absolutely cannot just have a disaster, short-term crisis mindset, because that leads to the worst outcomes. It leads to maladaptation. It leads to stripping human rights and agency from people who are at the most acute end of this crisis. So it's wrenching on a human level, completely wrenching, that we have pushed some people and places to these limits, but we have to get out ahead of it. Our policies, our stakeholder processes, our human rights-centered frameworks have to get out ahead of it. Otherwise, we're going to push many, many more people to just be on the move in crisis. And as we've seen with extreme disasters in the US, like hurricanes, who gets to get in that car and leave and go to stay in a hotel or their second vacation home has everything to do with money. Who gets to leave has to do with, is it the last day of the month when their paycheck has run out and they're living paycheck to paycheck? Or are you someone with means? And what we're seeing right now is people being forcefully dislocated, gentrification in communities around the US. We're seeing situations where existing programs that FEMA and HUD and others run rely on things like showing homeownership. FEMA only this year started to implement changes to that because heirs property is a direct result of Jim Crow laws in our country. Mortgage redlining is another legacy that we still live with in many urban areas. Just here in Boston, there was a study that was released in the last few days pointing out that even right now in Boston, the bulk of mortgages are going to white people, even in communities that are predominantly Black. So all of this inequity is colliding with climate change. Climate is only the latest risk factor, and we have to actually wrestle with the root causes here. It's not going to be enough to just put a patina of managed retreat on top of all of this hard stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, this reminds me of a story I heard from a woman in Austin who I was interviewing the other day, and she is a community organizer and resident in Dove Springs, which is a neighborhood on the edge of gentrification in Austin, which, as we all know, is a very rapidly gentrifying area, and there's a creek that runs through that neighborhood that was getting persistent flooding, and they had two especially devastating disasters in the neighborhood. And it's a low-income neighborhood. It's mostly Spanish-speaking people of color that live there. And when this flooding happened, the buyout program that came to the neighborhood ended up resulting in people who were flooded were bought out, sometimes not on the best terms, and then moved away. And now what's there is when there's a FEMA buyout program, I'm sure some of you know, there's a requirement to leave that land open and free of permanent indoor structures so that we don't replicate the flood loss. So now it's a park space, which on its surface sounds great. We've removed people from flooding danger. Now there's an open green space that we all can enjoy, and it can safely flood again. However, when she said, this park is really painful to me because now this area is being gentrified and people are coming here, people with money are moving in, and they see it as just this nice, pretty park. Oh, look how beautiful and peaceful it is. And actually, it's a place where people were displaced from their homes, and now people with more money are moving in. And they might not be living on the side of that park, but that's one way. We got some laughter about the community-supported relocation term, and I get that it's funny and jargony, and I struggle with these terms myself. But really, what we're talking about is, leading from the ground up, having the community design their own spaces. And so it's does any of you want to touch on that? And Lanor, I have a question for you next. But what are your thoughts when you think about how we can avoid this sort of replicating the status quo or even increasing inequality when we talk about relocation or plan for it?
I'll just offer a couple thoughts and then leave time for my colleagues and others. But I think that, as Rachel says, we need to get ahead of this problem, both at basically any and every level. And as we heard in the panel just before ours, there are measures that you can put in place even before a market is hot that switch in when the market gives you the opportunity to recapture some of the value gains that you may see as gentrification occurs and reinvest them in a way that's more equitable. So not only getting ahead of the potential for flooding or what have you by creating plans for equitable response, but anticipating the gentrification, the displacement, the increase in values that may occur and displace even more residents that have been there for generations perhaps, or prevent people who got a buyout at perhaps not the best rates, prevent them from finding anything they can afford anywhere near their original home. And I think getting ahead of that with smart land policy can help.
I'll add to that a bit. Maybe this is, I think about things maybe a little differently as an economist. I feel like the root problem of why climate change will be worse for people who are lower income or with lower wealth is because they have lower income and because they have lower wealth. So I would be in favor of some kind of climate reparations or redistribution of wealth, where we give people the money to make the choices for themselves, whether they want to reinvest it in their community or move somewhere else and build somewhere else. That's something that I would want to put on the table for how to make this as equitable as possible. Because every situation is a little bit different. In Sacramento, for example, the lower income and minority neighborhoods are in the place with the highest flood risk. So they're at risk of having where they live disrupted by flooding. But in a place like Florida, it's actually the minority communities that are on higher ground. So they're at risk of gentrification and people moving in, driving up property values, which is great if you're a homeowner, but very bad if you're a renter. So I think that we should maybe think about just the root cause of the wealth inequality and build up from there to think about how we can make people more resilient to climate change.
Yeah, maybe the thing I would add is thinking about where people go, receiving communities as well, because unfortunately what we see in the world today is migrants for the most part are treated with racism and xenophobia when they move. And that is whether within the US that happens even within a country. And so we have to be thinking about creating places where there is affordable housing, there are jobs, there's childcare, there's infrastructure in safer ground areas. And we have to think beyond individual decisions, because all of our existing programs are not designed to think as a community, as a collective. They're designed around individual home buyers. And that leads to this checkerboard kind of situation like we had after Hurricane Sandy when the Blue Acres program, for example, in New Jersey and others were administered. You go to neighborhoods and you see the checkerboard that happens when some people take the buyout and some don't. And then what the experience has been through interviews of people who took buyouts is they often didn't find a similar community or a similar kind of home somewhere else. So again, if we think millions of people are going to be faced with this, let's get ahead of it. This is not about 5 or 6 people selling a house and moving it somewhere else. So that's where I think in my work, I work on both clean energy transitions and climate resilience. And it's an inapt parallel, but the thing I think about is how do we treat coal communities and coal miners who are losing their jobs as we switch from coal? We gotta invest, get ahead of that problem. And similarly, we can't just say to people who are being forcibly displaced by climate change that, yeah, you got to deal with this on your own as an individual. This is a collective action problem. This is a public good that we get out ahead of it. And I think it's particularly hard in the United States because of the dominant structure to think about this as an individual. But even there, I will say that our work shows that the market is not taking this risk into account accurately right now. And it's because there's a mismatch in time horizons. The market's thinking in 3 to 5 years. So even what I just shared with you about those 2050 numbers is not being taken into account. And what they'll tell you is no one holds a mortgage for 30 years. We just flip them, we sell them. So we don't, 30-year mortgage, that might mean something to you as a consumer, but not to us. So lots of mismatches in incentives all around.
Thank you. Lanor, you mentioned when you spoke with us earlier about sort of the awareness in among like the Houma Nation about hunting season and trapping season and marking time by sort of this awareness of nature and the land and what's happening around us. And there are other indigenous cultures that call the months sugar making month or crusted snow moon and things like that. And they're seeing these like rhythms of nature start to be disrupted and actually having to contemplate new names for the months. And it's no longer sugar making moon because sugar making is done by then because it's warmer now. So, when we talk about where people are hit hardest, indigenous people are often cited as among the most physically vulnerable communities, but there are voices that, indigenous voices that reject that framing and say that actually because of our cultural ties to the land, we have this strength in the face of climate impacts. We know we can detect change, we can see it happening sooner and can respond in kind. So I guess how do we center that knowledge in our response to land loss and the question of where we live?
Excuse me, I think it ties back to what the rest of the panel was just talking about. And I think all of that really centers on the issue of trust. And so you have to have a level of trust in the folks you're working with. And so being able to, so even as we're talking about, and as I'm hearing you guys talking about programming and how to do wealth distribution and that kind of stuff, that even in the process of doing those things is the parties at play, there has to be some trust that exists in order for that to happen. That's a huge issue. One of the things I think, particularly at least in our community, is I think there's anger that exists where it's like, how many times can you continue to ignore me or feel very paternalistic of, oh, poor you, let me take care of you because you can't do this. You can't knowingly make a decision for yourself. The issue of the climate issues going on in our community, our people have been aware of it for decades. The problem has been is that the folks that have been in a situation to do something about it have done nothing because our community has not been a priority. And so we have been the line in the sand, and I think that's a major issue, is that the lines in the sand get drawn of who are the sacrificial communities that is okay to lose, and that we okay, well, we'll just deal with that later. I call that passive aggressive relocation. The fact that we do nothing for decades at a time. And so people on their own kind of like, okay, I'm getting tired, and they move on their own. And so what tends to happen is that you get one of two groups of people, I think, that are left. At the end is the folks that have dug in their heels and are, I'm not going no matter what. And the other group is the folks that can't afford to. And don't have the resources to do it. And so that's what you're left with, to be able to work through it. And, and the reality of it is so I'm going to pop some balloons here, but, if anybody ever tells you that the community, any community, and particularly if they're going to tell you in a Native community that everyone is on the same page, and that, that's not how community works. You know, if when the chief speaks and everyone follows, no, people have free will. You know, that's just not reality. That is total farce. If somebody's trying to tell you that line of bull crap, beware. That is not true. You know, it just doesn't work that way. You know, and what we have found is, you know, there are certain people that are going to reach a point of saying, I'm done. I'm ready to go. I'm ready. You know, I've reached a point of, I can't do this anymore, quicker than others. Some folks, I always kind of refer to it as kind of going through a grief process. It's the same way folks go through grieving. And some people can go through that grieving process really quick. Some people get stuck in stages. You'll have the folks that are going to deny it doesn't exist. Nope, climate change is not real. That stuff they're lying to you. That's not real. Some people are going to just be very sad and they're just, you know, going to just stay there. And some people are going to just be angry. You know, and some people are, you know, it's just the way it happens. And we have to be cognizant that we have to kind of honor people going through those processes. And they're not all going to reach it at the same time.
Thank you. Well, I think now we'll turn it out to the audience for questions.